There is a sickness plaguing the RTS strategy gaming genre, and it is the sickness of laziness. Or just perhaps a lack of motivation, a lack of willingness to innovate, or the sad lack of ambition. I'm referring to two games in particular, and they are surprisingly or not developed at least in part by the same developer studio. These games are Age of Empires 4 and Company of Heroes 3, developed by Relic Entertainment. Now first a disclaimer. This video is not meant as hate towards any one person or the group of people responsible for these games. Actually, it's not meant as hate at all, but as constructive criticism, and it's obvious that many developers work very hard to deliver products to the best of their ability. And by the way, while I have you here, only 6% of you watching this video are subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy my content, guys, it would just mean so much to me if you took the time to make a simple click and sub to the channel. It goes a long way in helping my content reach further, and hopefully also help you in knowing when there's new content to be enjoyed. I'd really appreciate it. In the past decade or so, there's been a whole lot of talk about the so-called death of the RTS genre. That is not a phenomenon I'm referring to in this video specifically. In fact, I think this death is somewhat overrated. It is true that RTS games in the classical sense, like StarCraft or Warcraft games, have become fewer and further between. But in fact, some of the biggest names in gaming, at least in the strategy genre, are fully or in part RTS games. Total War features full RTS battles making up about half of its gameplay, and the Paradox series are all RTS games. After all, RTS does stand for real-time strategy. But when most people refer to the death of RTS, they are talking about the very specific competitive or tactical RTS. Again, ones like StarCraft, Warcraft, or Command & Conquer. And it is certainly true that there were a lot more of these heavy hitters before. I grew up on games like Star Wars Empire at War, Lord of the Rings The Battle for Middle-earth, and Command & Conquer Generals. All real-time, all strategy, and all damn did they do freaking fantastic. They were all more or less based on the same concepts of building bases, gathering resources, and taking out the enemy base. But they all did it in their own way, in their own universe. It might sound weird, and I'm about 99% sure I'm not wearing rose-tinted glasses when saying this, but I genuinely feel like the vast majority of RTS games back in the early 2000s, at least the ones made by larger studios, were actually amazing. It really felt like developers strived to innovate and bring their own thing, and to create new ideas for what RTS could bring to the table. Middle-earth had a focus on characters leveling up, and massive set bases you expanded over time. Empire at War had land and space battles, and even a freaking awesome Galactic Conquest campaign map. And Command & Conquer brought that awesome realism and fast-paced gameplay it's known for. Back in the day, the Age of Empires series and Company of Heroes took the RTS world by storm. Whether we're talking the granular management of Age of Empires, optimizing your gameplay style to gather, build, and conquer faster, and which also dared to take the step into new time periods with every game, or with Company of Heroes, which brought a cinematic and epic sense of realism and skirmishes the RTS genre had truly never known before it. The classic RTS genre arguably peaked in the early 2000s, both in terms of quality and quantity. So why did it die? Or at least decline? In a sad turn of fate, I believe the RTS genre evolved away from its original path, and unintentionally morphed into the MOBA genre, multiplayer online battle arena games. They're very similar in many instances, controlling units from a bird's eye view, often defending a stronghold of some kind, and offering unique factions in fast moment-to-moment tactical warfare. Sadly, they lack a lot of the depth and beauty of the RTS of old in my opinion, and focuses more on addictive gameplay elements to keep the player hooked. In appealing to the masses, games like Dota 2 and League of Legends became wildly popular and profitable. At the same time, the cost of video game development rose significantly in the 2010s compared to prior years, and certain companies just stopped making games altogether. Keep also in mind that few of the companies behind RTS games were massive on their own, or they were bought up by larger publishers, and then basically shut down for whatever reason. Relic itself was in danger of falling into this trap actually, being first bought by THQ Nordic back in the day, and then sold to Sega. All of this, I believe, contributed to the decline of RTS as a genre, at least in this classic, often competitive-minded sense. But back in 2005, things were different. Age of Empires 3, made by Ensemble Studios, took the series into a completely new direction, not just offering up a new time period, but actually daring to experiment with new mechanics and gameplay styles. For better or worse, this game had ambition, passion, and the guts to do something new. Doing all of this while looking absolutely spectacular. The fact that these decades-old games are still so fun to play in their remastered versions all these years later says how good they were to begin with, and shows the passion that went into making each entry different and new. And then, in 2006, enter Relic Entertainment. Relic is something of a monolith in RTS terms, although I think we can again safely say for better or worse. Being the company behind successful titles like Homeworld and Warhammer 40k Dawn of War, Relic launched Company of Heroes in 2006. Company of Heroes was an absolutely fantastic breath of fresh air. Up to this point, I had no idea that PC strategy games could look this realistic, with each individual unit in Company of Heroes actually looking like fully animated characters on their own. It was fast-paced and fun, but also intense and extremely tactical. Company of Heroes was later expanded with expansions and a sequel, which despite not being nearly as fresh, did garner a large player base. And then we make it to the 2020s. Age of Empires 4 releases in late 2021, and Company of Heroes 3 comes out in early 2023. In other words, these are almost unnatural as sequels go, as they both released 10 and 18 whole years after the last games in the series. And for one of them, it really is kind of unnatural. Age of Empires 4 is in fact not developed by Ensemble Studios, which has now long since been shut down, but is resurrected by Relic Entertainment. Yes indeed, that is the same Relic Entertainment that made Company of Heroes. Age of Empires 4 brought the series back with a medieval and early modern inspired time period, added some cool unique faction mechanics, and a few new quality of life features like an improved user interface. But honestly, other than being a bit more modernized, Age of Empires 4 offered very little that wasn't already available 20 years ago. The game lacked any standout innovation in army management, faction diplomacy, or in the campaign department, all of which I think are natural steps for this series to take. Now it just looks like a cartoony version of Age of Empires 2, and a lot of people will therefore just continue to play Age 2 instead. Then we have Company of Heroes 3. This one is a tad different, actually trying to innovate by bringing a campaign map to the campaign mode, an improvement I absolutely approve of and wish to see more of. But it wasn't done quite as well as I'd hoped. It's not possible to play the campaign in multiplayer versus, for example, and even though Company of Heroes 3 in many ways builds on the previous games while modernizing certain parts of the gameplay mechanics, it doesn't actually do that much new. For all intents and purposes, Company of Heroes 3 feels so similar to the first game that it's crazy. The difference is that where the first game was revolutionary in more ways than one, and perhaps most of all in the visual department, Company of Heroes 3 feels more like a reboot than a sequel, more like a safe bet than a brave new vision, and more like a moneymaker than a passion project. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure the devs are all passionate about their work, but in terms of what's here, and in terms of actually being given a new and groundbreaking experience, this is just not it, and especially when it sells at full price. It just kinda dawns on you how amazing the first game looked and felt when you compare the three games today all these years later, and it's almost impossible to tell them apart. Relic, one of the largest companies in the strategy genre these days, and certainly in the RTS space especially, wields a lot of power. Age of Empires and Company of Heroes are literally two of the most recognizable and largest RTS series ever, and with the backing of Microsoft and Sega respectively, there's no excuse that can justify big budget games that play this safe, that feel so recognizable, and that come across as cost-effective reboots, more than representing grand, epic returns of two of gaming's biggest series. RTS is a genre near and dear to my heart, and so is being honest. That's why I will admit that Age of Empires 4 and Company of Heroes 3 are good enough games in and of themselves. I like playing them now and then for the odd rush, and I think they are amazing games if you've never played the games prior and are not already burnt out. But I can just as easily let them be and never come back really. In the end, being good is not what matters, because you've played good Age of Empires games before, in the same medieval era even. You've played Company of Heroes twice already over the past 2 decades. You know what good is, you know all too well what good feels like, and maybe you're tired of good. In fact, you already paid for good, and guess what? You can still play the games you paid for. So if all you're gonna do is get more of the same, why pay for it? Why bother? And that's the crux of this problem. There is virtually no innovation in the classic RTS space anymore, no grand new vision that elevates these games, no deeper mechanics or even visuals that fit into this current decade for us to gush over. And in my opinion, that's why modern RTS is so abysmal, why it's barely hanging on. It's not just the quantity of games lacking, but the quality. The lack of a need to actually be better than what came before. Say what you will about the big boys and girls of strategy like Creative Assembly and Paradox. Despite buggy releases or leaving certain games behind, at least they seem to try with each new release. You can actually expect innovation in one way or another, and for these games to genuinely feel different, even though you may not always like that difference. And I, for one, absolutely respect that. Because if nothing changes, the RTS genre will become just another genre of rehashes and quick cash grabs, of uninspired titles piggybacking off past glories and nostalgic memories. And in this day and age, when two legendary and promising series are awarded two games that frankly could have been released whenever in the past 15 years, I believe a lot of the blame lies with Relic. If there's anything we can demand of a company and game series that once offered so much, and which not exactly sells their games for cheap, it is demanding better. Because the only thing worse than the RTS genre dying off is that we won't care when it finally does. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love nothing more than for a true new RTS series to come back and blow everything else out of the water, but I have my doubts. Let me know your thoughts on the topic and this video in the comments, and as always, make sure to like the video and sub to the channel. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.